The city skyline stretched endlessly, every tower and glass panel catching the last rays of the fading sun. From the top floor of Cole Enterprises, the view was nothing short of breathtaking, a sweeping panorama of power and progress. Adrian Cole, the man who owned that view, was not just another executive in a tailored suit. He was a phenomenon. By 35, he had built one of the most profitable technology companies in the nation, made the covers of top business magazines, and turned small ventures into industry giants. People said he had the Midas touch. Everything he handled turned to gold. Yet, for all the shimmering glass and high-value stock tickers in his world, Adrian carried an emptiness that no portfolio could fill. The corporate dinners, the speeches, the accolades, they were all framed smiles and rehearsed applause. His penthouse apartment, perched high above the city, was silent except for the hum of expensive appliances he barely used. His relationships, if they could be called that, were transactional at best. Charming socialites who knew his wine preferences, but not his fears. Colleagues who respected his vision but never truly knew the man behind it. One drizzly Thursday evening, after another marathon day of meetings, Adrian decided to leave the office later than usual. The rain outside streaked down the tall windows in uneven lines, blurring the lights below. As he stepped into the marble-floored lobby, something caught his attention. Sitting at the security desk, partially hidden behind a stack of neatly organized reports, was a young woman in a crisp navy uniform. Her hair was tied back neatly, and she was reading, not scrolling through a phone, or idly flipping a magazine, but genuinely immersed in a well-worn paperback. The cover was faded, the pages slightly bent, a clear sign it had been read more than once. Her name tag read Elena. She didn't glance up when he passed, only shifting slightly to tuck a loose strand of hair behind her ear. It struck him as unusual. Most employees, even those in maintenance or security, looked at him with a mix of deference and curiosity. Elena didn't. She seemed entirely absorbed in her book, as if the CEO of the building had just walked by and she hadn't noticed, or didn't care. Adrian hesitated near the desk, curiosity outweighing his instinct to keep moving. "Good book?" he asked, his voice breaking the quiet hum of the lobby. She glanced up, meeting his eyes with a calm, measured look, then smiled politely. "Depends on your taste," she replied. "It's an old favorite." He noticed her tone, respectful but not overly deferential. She didn't fawn over him, didn't launch into questions about his company or his wealth. For a man used to people angling for favor, that was refreshing. "What's it about?" he asked, leaning against the desk casually. She closed the book just enough to show the title and said, "It's about someone who loses everything but finds the courage to start over." She gave a small shrug. "It's not exactly a bestseller, but it keeps me grounded." Something in her words resonated with him, though he wasn't sure why. After a short, pleasant exchange, he headed out into the rainy night, but the brief conversation stayed with him longer than he expected. The next evening, as the clock pushed past 9, Adrian found himself still in his office, his mind replaying that small moment at the security desk. When he finally left, she was there again, flipping through her book. This time, she noticed him first. "Burning the midnight oil again?" she asked lightly. He chuckled. "Part of the job description." And just like that, another short conversation began, about coffee preferences, the unpredictability of city weather, and a new cafe that had opened 2 blocks away. These interactions became small, but steady anchors in his otherwise chaotic days. He began timing his departures to coincide with her shifts. The decision, he told himself, was purely coincidental, but the truth was, Elena's presence had a grounding effect on him. She spoke about her life without embellishment. How she rented a small apartment in an old brick building. How she was helping her younger brother through school. How she dreamed of one day writing stories that people would remember. There was no envy in her voice when she mentioned his world. No subtle hints at wanting to be part of it. Adrian noticed something else too. While most people filled the air with empty chatter, Elena seemed comfortable with pauses. She didn't rush to fill every silence, and that gave their conversations a strange sense of ease. It reminded him of a time before his life became a non-stop performance, before every word he spoke was analyzed for strategy or influence. One night, as he left after another long day, he caught sight of her smiling at something in her book, her eyes lighting up for a fraction of a second before she turned the page. That small moment stayed with him on the elevator ride down, and even as his driver navigated the slick streets toward his penthouse, he found himself wondering about her more than he cared to admit. Adrian wasn't the type of man to linger in uncertainty. In the corporate world, hesitation was the enemy, and decisions, even the wrong ones, were better than none. But with Elena, the dynamic was different. He didn't quite understand why he found himself thinking about her in the middle of board meetings, or catching himself glancing at the lobby cameras from his office, as if expecting to see her there. It wasn't attraction in the usual sense, or at least, that's what he told himself. There was no obvious attempt from her to impress him, no flirtatious tone or coy glances. She was herself. And in a world where everyone seemed to play a part, that authenticity was rare. The shift in his routine was subtle at first. He started leaving the office just after 9, even if his work was unfinished. He began walking out through the main lobby, instead of taking the private elevator to the underground parking garage. He'd pause at her desk, exchange a few words about something small, the book she was reading, the quiet weather, the coffee shop down the block, and slowly, those moments began to mean more to him than the endless handshakes and staged conversations in the upper floors. One Friday evening, the rain had returned, tapping gently against the tall glass walls of the lobby. Elena was there as usual, but this time she wasn't reading. Instead, she was working through a crossword puzzle, her brow furrowed slightly in concentration. Adrian approached, leaning against the desk. "Tough one?" he asked. She glanced up and smirked. "Only if you've never heard of an 8-letter word for relentless pursuit." He chuckled and offered a guess. She shook her head, scribbling in the correct answer without giving him a hint. The conversation that night lasted longer than usual. She told him about her younger brother's graduation coming up, about the old neighborhood where she grew up, about how she worked the night shift because it allowed her to take classes during the day. She didn't speak with self-pity. Instead, her tone carried a quiet pride, as if every challenge she faced was just another step toward where she wanted to be. For a man like Adrian, whose life had been built on the fast lane of power and privilege, the idea of working 2 jobs and still finding the energy to pursue dreams was almost unfathomable. But it also fascinated him. The determination in her voice felt more genuine than any corporate success story he'd ever heard on a stage. That weekend, Adrian found himself restless. The dinner party he attended at a luxury hotel felt stale, the conversations painfully rehearsed. When a socialite sitting beside him launched into a monologue about her latest shopping trip to Milan, his mind wandered back to Elena sitting at her desk, tapping her pen against the crossword puzzle. He realized, with a strange clarity, that her presence had begun to cut through the static of his life in a way nothing else had for years. By Monday, he'd made a quiet decision. He wanted to know more about her, not in the way he knew his business contacts or his acquaintances in the city's elite circles, but in a way that allowed him to see the world through her perspective. That evening, when he saw her at the desk, he surprised himself by asking, "Have you had dinner yet?" Elena raised an eyebrow, clearly caught off guard. "I have a break in 20 minutes, she said carefully, as though weighing whether to accept. He smiled, just enough to take the edge off the invitation. "There's a place, 2 blocks away. Nothing fancy. Best soup in the city, I promise." They ended up sitting in a quiet corner of a small cafe, the kind with warm lighting and handwritten menus. Elena ordered a simple vegetable soup, and Adrian followed suit, deliberately avoiding the urge to order something that would mark him as the rich man in the room. The conversation was unforced. She spoke about books again, about the stories she wanted to write someday. He listened more than he talked, something that rarely happened in his life, and found himself laughing at her dry humor. But as they left the cafe, the air between them shifted, not because of anything either of them had said, but because of the looks they began to notice. A pair of suited businessmen glanced from Adrian to Elena, their expressions a mix of surprise and quiet judgment. A woman walking by with an expensive handbag looked at Elena's uniform, then at Adrian, and her lips curled slightly in a knowing smirk. Adrian was no stranger to being watched. In fact, he had lived most of his adult life under public scrutiny. But something about this felt different. The stares weren't about his status. They were about the contrast between him and the woman beside him. And as they walked back toward the building, he began to understand the unspoken rules that governed the society he moved in. Rules that said people like him didn't share soup in corner cafes with people like her. The following week, Adrian noticed a shift in the way people interacted with him. Subtle at first, but impossible to ignore. In the Monday board meeting, his head of public relations, Celeste, lingered after everyone else had left. She smiled politely, but with that measured tone she used when delivering delicate news. "I ran into someone from the Chamber of Commerce this weekend," she began, "and they mentioned seeing you out and about with someone." He didn't respond right away, letting the silence stretch between them. Celeste's smile didn't falter, but her eyes carried an unspoken question. "Of course, it's none of my business," she added lightly. "But in our world, perception is, well, everything." Adrian gave her a faint, dismissive nod. But after she left, he sat there for a moment, staring out the tall windows of his office. It was a strange feeling, this awareness that his personal choices were already making their way into whispered conversations. And it wasn't even anything scandalous. He'd simply had soup with someone. But in his social circle, it wasn't the act that mattered. It was the person. By Wednesday, the whispers had turned into veiled remarks. At a charity dinner, one of his longtime acquaintances, Mark, leaned over with a smirk. "Didn't know you were into uniforms, Adrian," he said, his tone dripping with innuendo. Adrian gave him a cold look, but Mark only chuckled, clearly enjoying his little jab. Across the table, a couple of the other guests exchanged glances, as though they were in on some inside joke. He tried to brush it off, but it didn't end there. On Thursday morning, his mother called. She rarely involved herself in his romantic life, mostly because she had given up trying to influence it years ago. But this time her voice carried a note of concern. "Darling," she began carefully, "I've heard something unusual. Is it true you've been spending time with a security guard from your building?" Adrian closed his eyes for a moment, leaning back in his chair. "Yes," he said simply. There was a pause on the other end, and then a sigh. "I see. Well, I'm sure she's perfectly lovely. But you must understand how people will talk. These things have a way of becoming complicated." Complicated. The word lingered in his mind long after the call ended. To his mother, complicated wasn't about emotions or logistics. It was about status, reputation, and the quiet rules of the social hierarchy. That evening, as he left the building, he saw Elena at her usual post. She looked up and smiled, the kind of genuine smile that didn't ask for anything in return. It struck him how little she knew about the conversations happening in the shadows. Or maybe she did know, and simply didn't care. Either way, the sight of her grounded him in a way nothing else had that week. He walked over, resting his forearms on the edge of the desk. "Busy night?" he asked. "Not yet," she replied. "But there's a conference upstairs, so I'm expecting the usual haze in about an hour." They talked for a few minutes, but Adrian noticed the curious glances from people walking through the lobby. Some of them tried to be discreet, pretending to check their phones as they passed. Others were less subtle, openly studying the two of them, as if they were trying to figure out what was going on. Later that night, he received an email from a fellow CEO he occasionally collaborated with. The subject line read, "Friendly advice." The message was short. "You've worked too hard to let the wrong association chip away at your image. People notice everything." Adrian stared at the email for a long time before closing his laptop. He felt an unfamiliar mix of anger and frustration, not at Elena, but at the arrogance of a world that believed it could dictate who he should or shouldn't care about. He had built his company from the ground up, outmaneuvering rivals and enduring years of relentless competition. And yet, somehow, sharing a conversation with a woman in a security uniform was the thing that might tarnish his image. The absurdity of it all only made him want to push back harder. He didn't want to play into their narrative, didn't want to shrink into the safe, polished mold they expected. Still, there was a lingering awareness that these judgments weren't going away. If anything, they were gaining momentum. The next day, Adrian decided to walk Elena home after her shift. It was late. The streets quiet, except for the occasional hum of a passing car. She seemed surprised by the offer, but didn't refuse. They walked side by side, talking about small things, a new bakery that had opened nearby, a movie she wanted to see, the way the city felt different at night. When they reached her building, she hesitated before speaking. "I've noticed people looking at us," she said softly. "Not just in the lobby. Outside too. It's different." Adrian met her gaze, realizing that she wasn't as unaware as he had thought. There was no bitterness in her tone, but there was a quiet honesty that told him she understood more than she let on. And in that moment he knew that the pressure from his world wasn't just aimed at him. It was pressing on her too in ways she hadn't asked for but was already enduring. The gala night was supposed to be the final test. Adrian had invited Mara as his guest of honor, knowing full well the kind of whispers they would face. The ballroom shimmered with chandeliers, the air thick with the scent of roses and polished ambition. People in designer gowns and sharp tuxedos floated around the room, exchanging practiced smiles and calculated handshakes. When Mara walked in beside him, in a simple but elegant navy dress, every head turned. The first murmurs came almost instantly. A few curious looks, some raised brows, and one or two disapproving glances from people Adrian had known for years. They didn't need to say anything. Their eyes said it all. "She doesn't belong here." Mara felt the weight of their stares, her hand tightening slightly on Adrian's arm. He leaned in and whispered, "They don't matter. You matter." But the real challenge came during the dinner. Seated at the main table, with investors and longtime associates, Mara found herself answering polite but probing questions about her career path and how she and Adrian met. The subtle condescension in their voices was undeniable. One guest even laughed lightly, saying, "Well, that's unexpected. A CEO and a security guard. That's a first for me." Mara smiled politely but stayed quiet. Adrian, however, didn't let it pass. "Unexpected," he said evenly, "is just another word for brave. I don't make decisions based on the comfort zones of others." The table went silent. The tension built until one of the investors took him aside during a break. "Adrian, I'll be frank. This relationship could affect your image. Clients and partners expect a certain standard. Dating someone from, well, her background. It's not good optics." That was the moment Adrian realized the decision he was making wasn't just about love. It was about whether he would keep living for others' expectations or stand by what truly mattered to him. Later that night, after the speeches and champagne, Adrian walked Mara out to the balcony. The city skyline glittered below them, 1,000 lights against the dark. She turned to him and said softly, "You don't have to fight for me, Adrian. I don't want to be the reason you lose what you've built." He shook his head. "Mara, you're not the reason. You're the reason I finally see what all of this is for." And with that, he took her hand and led her back into the ballroom. Instead of quietly blending into the background, Adrian stepped onto the small stage meant for the band's next set. He tapped the microphone, drawing everyone's attention. "I've spent my whole life chasing success," he began, his voice steady. "I thought it meant building an empire, earning respect, and having everything money could buy. But none of that matters without someone who makes you feel human. Mara does that for me. She's the strongest, kindest, most grounded person I've ever known. If that makes me less in your eyes, then so be it, because in mine, it makes me more than I've ever been." The room was silent, except for the faint hum of the air conditioning. A few people looked uncomfortable. Others glanced at one another, unsure how to react. But Mara's eyes were filled with tears. In that moment, the opinions, the whispers, the so-called standards, they all dissolved. Adrian had chosen her, not in secret, not as a quiet rebellion, but openly, defiantly, and without shame. As the music began again, he took her in his arms and led her to the dance floor. Around them, conversations resumed. But now the stairs carried something different. Maybe curiosity, maybe respect, or maybe the realization that love, when it's real, has a way of silencing even the loudest critics. For the first time in years, Adrian wasn't thinking about his image, his reputation, or the next deal on the horizon. He was simply there, holding the woman who had reminded him that the truest kind of wealth wasn't in the bank, it was in the heart. And he knew, without a doubt, that this was the life he wanted, no matter what anyone said.